first I will explain, I guess I want to set the scene by giving you the coalition's story on where we're at with the deficit and austerity and needing to pay off this crippling debt. The coalition have been telling us with a really kind of iron discipline. I mean, Tory and Liberal Democrat ministers, MPs alike have been hammering this home week after week after week, the last 18 months at least, saying that UK deficit and debt are out of control because of Labour's overspending, the principal villain of the piece being Gordon Brown, of course. By May 2010, this had reached unsustainable levels, we're told, risking an increase in government borrowing costs, the famous bond vigilantes poised to strike, meaning that, unfortunately, it's always said with kind of hand-wringing, severe austerity eliminating the structural deficit. I'm as sceptical as Anne was about what that actually means, structural in practice, but we'll come back to that. Eliminating the structural deficit over the course of this one Parliament. So a very, very big fiscal consolidation in 5 years is the only course of action left to the UK, and this will enable us to get into the sunny uplands of sustainable private sector growth by kind of cutting back the state. The private sector will begin to flourish. So this is what we're told in 4 bullet points. In one sentence, David Cameron says, if you have maxed out your credit card, if you put off dealing with the problem gets worse. Cameron said that, Osborne said that, and I'm sure there's a quote from Nick Clegg kicking around somewhere. He's normally in the background making a nasty noise whenever anything happens with this government. So that's what we've been told. This talk is really trying to put the record straight, and I'll concentrate on 3 points, although there's a lot of other things related to it that we can discuss in the session afterwards. The first thing I want to show is that every part of the coalition story is at least partially wrong, and in many cases completely wrong. Just a misconception and a distortion. Austerity, far from being the ticket to the promised land, has been a disaster, and I think will continue to be so for some time to come. And thirdly, I want to say, well, if all the evidence points to the fact that what we're doing at the moment is disaster, how are they getting away with it? Why is the narrative so pervasive? And the last couple of slides will talk about that. So I just want to give you a couple of graphs. So some of my graphs are pretty similar to Anne's. This one's slightly different. This is what, if I was, say, a Conservative or Liberal Democrat minister defending what's being done at the moment, I'd put this graph up. Okay, and it's government tax receipts in the green line and public spending, including investment spending, both as a share of GDP, starting in 96-97. So we can see what happens when New Labour comes along. Spending's already running ahead of receipts from about 2002 onwards, and then you see when we get to the financial crisis, the Great Recession of 2008. The spending line just kind of goes up from 40% to 48%, the peak in about 2009-10, and then we see the coalition, unfortunate but we're told inevitable, unavoidable medicine, getting spending, including investment, down, having been out of control for those few years after the crash. So that's the way they present it. If you use a slightly different depiction of the same data, you can see what's really going on, I think. This is exactly the same to the two lines here, exactly the same information, but rather than using share of GDP, I'm using just nominal spending in billions of pounds, okay? So what you can see here is you can see an upward trend in spending over time, but that's to be expected because, given that we have inflation, etc., and given that GDP is rising in real terms for most of the period, you'd expect that to be happening. And receipts are also going up over time, not quite as fast, and there is a slight gap between the two by 2007-8, but I'll come back to that on the next slide. And then what you see is that receipts basically fell off a cliff after 2007-8, and that's what opens up that huge gap. Okay, so it's not a splurge in spending; it's a fall off in tax revenue. that's causing that. If I change the yellow line slightly so that I am putting on current spending only, not investment spending, you'll see that up to 2007-8, the government was meeting its kind of fiscal rule of only borrowing to invest over the cycle reasonably well. Now, there are issues because obviously, there were problems with the economy, imbalances by 2006-7, growing private debt, all the rest of it, the huge problems of the financial situation. I'm not saying everything was, hunky-dory by 07, but you can see clearly that there's the massive drop-off in tax receipts, 07, 08, 08, 09, and that's what's opening up that big gap. Furthermore, you can see that a huge reduction in the growth path of spending, some of which is cut off in investment, but some of it's just a big spending squeeze, which I'll come back to in the coalition plans 2011 through to 2016-17. So I don't think it's a case of overspending. I think it's a case that tax revenue collapsed. There was a close track between current spending and tax revenue between prior to 2007-8. There was a lot of public investment going on, but you'd expect that because any business would invest to create a stream of revenue later, and government with infrastructure spending doing exactly the same thing. Furthermore, with borrowing rates as low as they were, and I'll show you some information on borrowing rates in a minute, it would have been actually irrational not to have public investment under those circumstances. It would have been silly to turn down public investment opportunities. So I think what was going on prior to 2007-08 was reasonably sensible, notwithstanding the problems of financial sector running out of control and so forth. The Great Recession of 2008 did cause a collapse in tax revenues, a really big collapse. And a lot of that was due to fragility. I mean, we had a huge hole in the corporate tax balance sheet. Corporate receipts kind of fell off a cliff. The financial sector was a big part of that because suddenly these guys were running huge losses, and before that they'd been racking up huge profits. Also, rising unemployment, lower wage growth, all of that affects the income tax and national insurance receipts, and lower spending mean lower VAT receipts. So a lot of that was kind of, it was a big slump, and that meant that spending after 2007-8 was essential. If we hadn't put our spending up quite a lot after that, we would have had a deepening economic depression because output would have fallen even more, and we would have had even less tax revenue. So there was an obvious kind of Keynesian cyclical rationale for increased spending after 2007-8, both through what are called the automatic stabilisers, unemployment benefits, the fact that people moving out of work don't pay tax, etc. And also the limited fiscal stimulus we did have. I'm thinking mainly of the VAT cut, which helped for a year or so in 2009 until it was withdrawn. So all that I think was essential and very, very proper. Now the second thing the coalition says is that debt reached unsustainable levels. And again, if I was the coalition spokesman presenting this here today, I would give you this graph with this scale, this horizontal scale. Starting in 97, you can see that the government, the previous government had a thing called sustainable investment rule, right, which is that the net public sector debt to GDP ratio should always be below 40%. And you can see that from the time that just after they took office through to 2007, they were meeting that just about, okay? And then it looks like you've got this huge kind of upward trend in debt, up to 70%. And then after 2012, I've got the projections from the Office for Budget Responsibility showing a peak at around 78% in 2015. So, big increase in debt on that scale. Now, if you change the horizontal scale, you'll see this in some real economic historic perspective. Economics are very ahistorical science for many economists. They don't really know what happened, before 2 years ago in the Economic Journal or whatever. If you show them what happened, you see that in 1945 or 1946, the peak of that graph, net debt GDP ratio peaked at about 240%. Okay. Now, if the credit card was maxed out in 2011, then we were sort of triple maxed out in 1946. So why didn't the economy just collapse. It didn't collapse. The Attlee government built the welfare state, NHS, etc. And steady growth combined with moderate inflation through the 50s, 60s, even the early 70s, saw that debt to GDP ratio just fall, pretty much continuously in a curve until it reached around sort of 45% in 1980. So you can see, that by the standards of the post-war period, the debt levels of 2011, 2012 are by no means unsustainable. If you go back even further, taking it back to 1700, as long back as there's any kind of reliable data, you see that the kind of post 1975 period is very unusual. Only in the late 19th century and early 20th have we had debt levels anywhere near as low as that, and in the very start of the period. In fact, for most of this, we were maxed out, or much more than maxed out, for the whole 18th century, for most of the 19th, and indeed for the interwar period and World War II, and most of the... there's a lot of maxing out going on here, is all I can say. We seem to be maxed out squared. So is this really... is our current debt level unsustainable? A historical perspective would suggest it's not. Looking at it a slightly different way, because sometimes the coalition takes a slightly different tack to say that debt interest payments are unsustainable, so they make it a year-on-year thing rather than the stock of debt. But debt interest payments on UK debt are so low now by historical standards that we're actually paying substantially less than we were in, say, the 1980s under the Mrs Thatcher's administration, and also under most of the John Major period. So actually, using debt interest instead of the debt stock makes the point I was making previously even more strongly. Now, I don't often put formulae, equations in my talks, mainly because when I write them down, I normally write them down wrong. And I've actually done that here. So this is it's only a minor fault. The left-hand side should be changing debt GDP ratio from T to T plus 1. So it's like just imagine a triangle on the left-hand side there for delta, right? What I'm trying to do here is show what determines the path of debt GDP over time. What I think there's basically three factors. One is the small d there, that's the deficit that you run this year as a proportion of the GDP. R is the real interest rate that you're paying on servicing your debt, and G is the real growth rate of GDP. Okay, and those three factors, R minus G, you multiply by your existing stock of debt, and that shows that plus your deficit for this year shows you what your debt stock will be next year. Now, by looking at that, without trying to freak people out with maths too much, imagine that that's in a steady state of constant debt year on year. So your real debt GDP is just just trundling along in a straight line. Why would your debt stock grow starting from there? What three different things could cause the debt stock to grow? The real interest rate could rise, and this is the bond vigilantes, right? This is what the coalition's banged on about. They've said if we don't take steps to reduce the debt, the real interest rates will rise, and the debt stock will kind of go up. Now, other things being equal, that may be true. Although I'd argue, and we can come back to this, there's no real reason to expect our real interest rates to rise because we're outside the Eurozone and can control our currency, but we can come back to that. But that's only one of the factors at work here. The crucial one is that if growth falls, if economic growth falls, the debt will increase, other things being equal, if you start from a position where it's just kind of in a steady state. And also if the deficit rises, which again could be caused by growth falling, then the debt will rise. So there are those two factors often ignored by the coalition. In particular, growth falling has been completely ignored by the coalition. And I'll show you that with some forecasts from the OBR, government debt to GDP. Now, what this is, moving down, you've got the forecast for fiscal year 2011-12, that's the current year, through to 2016-17. And then in the middle column, you've got the June 2010 budget forecasts. These are forecasts for debt GDP ratio, right? So at that point, they thought it would go from 67.2 it would max out at 70.3 and then go down after that. There's no figure for 2016-17 in that column because they only forecast 5 years ahead. Okay. Now, by the time 18 months later, almost in the November 2011 autumn statement, that had been heavily revised upwards. It wasn't going to peak in 2013-14. It was instead going to peak at 2014-15 at 78%, right? And then only just be coming down after that. So a big increase in the projected debt to GDP ratio. Why was that? It's nothing to do with increases in interest rates. Nothing, that they weren't predicting increases in interest rates. It's to do with declining growth, okay, declining projections for growth. This is the same documents showing the forecast for real GDP growth. When the coalition came in, they believed in a thing called expansionary fiscal austerity, the idea being that if you cut, confidence will come back and you'll grow. And you can see that in the initial OBR forecast going from 2.3% in 2011 up to 2.8, 2.9, 2.7, 2.7. Now, what they're saying is, thanks Dave, they're saying 2011 you've got only 0.9% growth. And that was almost an outrun figure at that time because they'd had most of 2011 already. And then it's going to go down to 0.7 and only recover to 2.1 in 2013. And the indications at the moment are that 2013 will actually be worse than that, if anything. So you can see the effect of austerity in terms of depressing growth is actually making it harder to achieve any of George Osborne's targets for deficit, for debt GDP ratio. And that I think is the kind of self-defeating nature of austerity. This Anne mentioned this graph but didn't put it up, but I think it's a nice one to put up. The UK is now doing the current economic crisis, which is the blue line, is now worse than the 1930s, largely because the recovery has been so weak. We are still 4% in real terms below the peak real output, which was reached in 2008. In the 1930 to 34 depression, they had actually recovered real to the kind of gain line, if you like, within 4 years. We probably will take 6 years to do that, and we might not even make it for that. And that only gets us back to real GDP being at where it was in 2008. Normally, you'd expect about 2.5% growth a year. That's the kind of trend rate for the last 50 years or so. A similar story in Europe. I'll leave that. But basically, if anything, austerity in Europe, the impacts have been even worse. I'll have to skate through the last few slides. As Anne said, austerity has severe costs. High unemployment, youth unemployment reaching scandalously high levels now in the UK and the Eurozone. Also female unemployment, mainly because public sector workers disproportionately women, so bearing the brunt of the cuts. There are human costs of that now, and also, particularly for younger workers, unemployment has a scarring effect, makes it harder for them to get jobs later. Spending cuts in distributionary terms are strongly regressive. The paper I presented at Radstat's conference last year, done with Tim Horton, showed the distributionary impacts of spending cuts fall strongly on the least well-off. Because of the collapse in confidence, we've seen a collapse in investment, both government investment and private sector business investment. And we're also seeing the OBR is predicting increasing consumer debt, even from the high levels that Anne presented. They now predict going up to about 161% of GDP, the private sector debt stock by 2016. So there are these huge kind of costs. Now, is it stupidity or malice that we've come to this? Any economist with half a brain can see that there's no support for austerity in the data. Now, not all economists have half a brain, unfortunately. So a lot of them are kind of brainwashed into having less than that. But I don't think Conservative politicians are stupid. I don't think that's the reason they're going for this. Rather, they're using the crisis to advance a small state agenda that was pre-existing before the crisis hit. Before the crisis hit, the Tories had a terrible problem because Labour always framed the election. 2001, 2005, it was Labour investment versus Tory cuts. 2010 wasn't that. It was Tory cuts versus Labour's anaemic version of the Tory cuts programme. And that transformed the debate. We can talk maybe a bit more in the session about why that was. But these are some statistics from IMF that Peter Taylor-Gooby referenced in a recent paper. UK spending GDP as a percentage, UK public spending as a percentage of GDP will fall below the USA by 2015. So we're actually heading for a state that's smaller than the US state. The US often seen as the champion of small government, you know, minimal government in the G7, although that's a slightly, you know, simplistic view. But yeah, we are going to be the small government guys in that group by then. So there's something very deep ideological going on here. How are they getting away with this? Last slide. We'll talk more about this in the session. The problem is that the maxed out credit card line, comparing the government to a household, seems logical at first glance. It's incredibly persuasive. It's a simple argument. It's a powerful argument. It's difficult to argue against in today's soundbite kind of media debate. And it's the return of early 80s Mrs. T handbag economics, you know, that people responded to it back then, and many people sadly still respond. The media are mostly sympathetic. They're not all sympathetic. People like Martin Wolf, Larry Elliott, Paul Krugman and the New York Times are very unsympathetic, but there's still a huge dead weight of people backing this. Opposition within Parliament is weak, largely due to kind of splitting about how to respond to this in the Labour Party. And something very clever went on with Conservative spin doctors. They managed to spin the crisis as one of government debt, right, rather than what it really was, which was an unsustainable private sector growth model leading to out-of-control financial sector, extreme volatility, asset and house price bubbles, subprime debt, etc. This was the big problem. This was why the banks had to be bailed out in 2008, and it's been kind of spun round into this government debt crisis. And that's the depressing thing. So the question is what we do about it, and that's what we're hopefully going to discuss in the session in a minute.
Okay,